Hey everyone, tonight, we're drifting back to the dim, creaking edges of medieval Europe. So, if you're settling in, blanket pulled up, lights fading out, good. Take a slow breath. Because tonight's story wanders into the uneasy twilight before the witch trials. Not the bonfires or the panicked sermons. Not even the frenzied courtroom confessions. But the quiet, petty, strangely domestic mess that happened before all of that, when a woman was only suspected of witchcraft. This is the slow, ambling prelude. The part history classes tend to skim over. The part where nothing official has happened yet, but somehow her life is already unraveling. So let's drift gently into that world, where superstition mixed with gossip, and where the pathway to a formal accusation began not with demons or lightning storms, but with someone's cow refusing to cooperate. The soft spiral into suspicion. In medieval villages, the road to being labeled a witch wasn't dramatic. It didn't require curses or cauldrons, or even particularly suspicious behavior. All it took was being nearby when something mildly unfortunate happened. A pot cracked. Milk spoiled. A neighbor tripped over a chicken. Congratulations, you were now interesting. The earliest stage wasn't an accusation. It was more like socially sanctioned squinting. People began to watch you with what we might call medieval side eye, which was similar to regular side eye but more committed and usually accompanied by the sign of the cross. Your neighbors didn't confront you directly. They just whispered. And medieval whispers were powerful things. They traveled faster than news, faster than carts, faster than reason. A whisper could complete a full loop around a village before someone had even finished complaining about the weather. Before you knew it, you had become the unofficial explanation for everyday inconveniences. The bread didn't rise. Unfortunately, that wasn't the yeast's fault. It was yours. The wind sounded vaguely annoyed last night. Also yours. And so, suspicion began to cling to you. Not enough to be hauled before a judge, but just enough to make your daily life feel like walking through a fog of poorly hidden glares. The social cooling off period, except it didn't cool anything. Once you were in the possible witch category, you entered a strange phase of medieval life that historians sometimes call pre-trial suspicion, though it was less of a phase and more of a slow social unraveling. People stopped asking you to help with communal chores. At first, it felt polite, like being spared the worst parts of medieval life, which honestly sounds nice. But it wasn't kindness. It was fear wrapped in small talk. Your neighbors avoided taking food from your hands. Children were told not to play near your doorway. The baker who had once greeted you warmly now nodded as if you were a moderately dangerous animal that he hoped was well fed and disinclined to bite. And the church, well, the church didn't directly condemn you. But the priest might start giving sermons that included delicately vague statements like, "Some among us may unwittingly allow the devil's presence into their homes." Delivered while he looked directly at you, because subtlety was not a medieval strong point. That time-tested ritual, community gossip. Let's drift into a village tavern. It's smoky, loud, and crowded with people who haven't bathed in a while but are doing their best. You are, of course, not inside it, because anyone suspected of witchcraft knew better than to enter the village's primary gossip factory. Inside, the conversation is warm, mildly drunk, and deeply unfair. Gossip was the medieval social media feed, unregulated, unstoppable, and chronically misinformed. And once your name entered the scroll, it stayed there. Did you hear her cow gives no milk? She was seen walking at dawn. She grows herbs. She doesn't grow herbs. She stared at me for a bit too long last Sunday. None of these things were crimes. They were just facts, rearranged until they looked suspicious. If you were old, or widowed, or childless, or simply disliked, well, those were bonus points in your witchcraft profile. Being poor didn't help. Being independent also didn't help. Being opinionated helped least of all. Eventually, someone would say something like, "Well, I'm not saying she's a witch. I'm just saying, it's interesting, isn't it?" And that was enough. Once the village reached this level of communal agreement, you weren't just a person anymore. You were a problem waiting for a solution. The kindly neighborly visit. Eventually, the gossip phase escalated into one of the medieval world's most uncomfortable traditions. The neighbor visit. Not the pleasant kind. Not the, "here's some bread," kind. More like the, "we just want to check that you're alright," kind, spoken in the tone of someone who is definitely judging your curtains. 2 or 3 women, usually the talkative ones, would show up at your home. They arrived with an air of forced politeness, like they were trying to see whether your kitchen smelled like rosemary or brimstone. They asked gentle questions about your health, your sleep, your dreams, whether you ever felt strange at night. They'd comment on your cat, in the tone people use when assessing whether a pet is simply a pet or perhaps a backup sorcerer. If you had herbs drying on your wall, they asked what they were for, even if they already knew. If you didn't have herbs drying on your wall, that was also suspicious. Consistency was not their goal. Their visit ended with a promise to keep an eye out, which in medieval terms meant, we will absolutely continue talking about you for the foreseeable future. The local healer, or wise woman, check. Sometimes, the next step involved another woman, one with a respected if ambiguous place in the community. The local healer. She had herbs. She had knowledge. She had opinions. And she had no desire to be mistaken for you, which meant she handled this carefully. If she thought you were harmless, she might defend you. Although her defense usually sounded like, oh, she's no witch. Just a bit odd. Which is better than the alternative, but not by much. If she didn't like you, or thought your oddness might attract unwanted church attention toward her, then things could become difficult. She might agree that something seemed off. She might imply she'd sensed darkness around your home, always in a very nonspecific, flexible way. This subtle endorsement of suspicion was all the validation the village needed. The quiet test phase, observing you like a nervous chicken. At this point, people began quietly testing you. These tests were not official. They weren't recorded. But they were often the deciding factor between suspicious neighbor and formal accusation. They included such scientific procedures as 1. Dropping an item near you. If you picked it up too quickly, it meant you wanted power over the person who dropped it. If you picked it up too slowly, it meant you feared being trapped. If you didn't pick it up at all, that was rude, and therefore suspicious. 2. Asking you to bless something. A loaf of bread, a child, a chicken. If your blessing didn't immediately fix everything in that person's life, this confirmed their concerns. 3. Watching your reaction to misfortune. If you laughed, you were cruel. If you smiled, you were pleased. If you looked sad, you were pretending. If you looked neutral, you were hiding something. Basically, nothing you did could prove your innocence. You were starring in the medieval version of a rigged personality quiz, and the only available result was witch. The sudden household inspection. Sometimes, neighbors escalated to what they called helping. They would invite themselves inside your home to check on you, which meant poking around your belongings. They weren't subtle. They opened chests. They inspected cupboards. One might casually lift your bedsheets, as though witches stored dark magic underneath mattresses like loose coins. They often discovered things that were perfectly normal: dried plants, religious icons, bits of fabric. But everything looked dangerous if you squinted and had a good imagination. If they found a charm you'd made for protection, well, that looked like sorcery. If they found nothing suspicious, well, that meant you were hiding things. It was a lose-lose situation with very poor interior privacy standards. The rumor reaches important ears. Eventually, someone in authority heard the whispers. And this usually meant one of two people: the local priest, or the local manor lord. Neither was ideal. The priest, if especially zealous, might begin dropping pointed comments into sermons. He might discuss the dangers of hidden sin. He might remind the congregation that Satan walked in the guise of an ordinary woman, which everyone agreed was a very thought-provoking coincidence. The manor lord, meanwhile, rarely understood village dynamics but understood the importance of preventing panic. So if several peasants complained to him about unnatural events, he might decide an investigation was necessary, mostly because it sounded easier than listening to them argue about it every market day. Neither priest nor lord needed evidence. They needed only the sense that order was slipping. And in medieval Europe, nothing caused disorder faster than a whisper about witchcraft. The final stage, the watch. Before any official accusation, before paperwork, before interrogation, there was one final step. The watch. People observed you more intensely, as though waiting for you to either perform sorcery or confess out of sheer social exhaustion. Men walking past your home stared longer. Women at the well stopped talking when you approached. Even the village dogs seemed to react differently, not because you were dangerous, but because the dogs were picking up on all the nervous human energy around them. In some places, people literally watched your windows. They wanted to see if you lit candles late at night, or spoke to yourself, or owned more cats than they personally considered reasonable. If anything happened during this period, anything at all, it could trigger a formal charge. A storm, a miscarriage, a sick cow, an unlucky fall, a man waking up with a headache after drinking too much ale. Misfortune was your enemy now, and misfortune was extremely common in medieval life. Once the community believed it had seen enough, someone would finally step forward and make the accusation. But by then, the damage had already been done. Your life was changed long before any trial. The trial was just the final formality. And we'll drift onward soon, into exactly what those early accusations led to, how the first hearings unfolded, and why medieval justice was equal parts tragic, improvisational, and bewilderingly confident in itself. But for now, let's rest right here, at that quiet, precarious moment, when suspicion was heavy in the air and the world around an innocent woman had already begun to reshape itself into something fearful. Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's drift a little deeper into the past tonight, far from the flicker of witch hunters and suspicious neighbors. Now we're settling ourselves somewhere equally uncomfortable, but in a different way, the long, dull, strangely domestic life of ordinary soldiers during ancient wars. So, if you're wrapped up and sleepy, good. Because ancient warfare, despite all the epic poetry and dramatic retellings, was long stretches of absolute boredom interrupted by short, unpleasant moments of chaos. And soldiers, especially the regular ones, not the polished commanders with personal tent attendants, became masters in the art of killing time. Sometimes literally, but mostly figuratively. Let's wander into their camps, slowly, where smoke curls from cook fires, the air smells faintly like sweat and onions, and someone is already complaining about the rations. The very first thing they did, nothing, absolutely nothing. Before we go into the specifics, it's important to recognize the core truth of ancient campaigning. Most days, nothing happened. Armies marched, yes, but after marching they simply sat around waiting. Waiting for orders. Waiting for enemy movement. Waiting for weather to improve. Waiting for pay that would definitely not arrive when promised. Soldiers became experts at doing nothing while looking like they were doing something, which is arguably the foundation of many later bureaucratic traditions. They lounged on their bedrolls. They stared at the sky. They poked the dirt with sticks in a meaningful, soldierly way. And all of that counted as passing time. But doing nothing only works for so long before the mind wanders into thoughts like, I wonder how many bugs are in my boots today. So naturally, soldiers developed certain preferred activities to fill the dead space. Eating, a major portion of the soldierly schedule. Let's drift over to the campfire. This is where soldiers spent a surprising amount of time, not just eating, but negotiating with their rations. Ancient rations were consistently disappointing. Most soldiers lived on various combinations of hard bread capable of doubling as a primitive weapon, grain mush, occasionally decorated with a sad sprig of something, slightly questionable meat, onions, if fate was merciful, wine mixed with water, because the water alone was a gamble. A great deal of time was spent softening hard bread in wine. This was considered both a culinary technique and an emotional coping mechanism. Cooking was a communal affair. One soldier might claim he knew how to season barley properly. Another might insist he had a family method that probably never existed. Everyone else listened politely because there were no alternatives. The act of preparing food filled hours. And eating it filled more, partly because it took genuine effort to chew through ancient military bread without loosening teeth. Complaining. The universal military tradition. After eating came complaining. Complaining was not just a pastime, it was a lifestyle. Soldiers complained about the food, the commander, the weather, marching, the enemy, the lack of fighting, the amount of fighting, their pay, their boots, their tentmates, their tentmates snoring, the general unfairness of life. And of course, any new orders. This wasn't rebellious behavior. It was a bonding ritual. If you didn't complain, your comrades assumed something was deeply wrong with you. A soldier in good spirits was suspicious. A soldier complaining was perfectly normal. Gambling. The preferred hobby of men with very little money. Let's drift toward another fire. Here we find groups of men tossing dice or marked stones with intense concentration. Gambling was the beating heart of military leisure. It filled long stretches of boredom with short bursts of hope followed by long stretches of regret. Ancient armies gambled with small coins, bits of food, spare thread, shiny stones, the promise to do someone's chores. Literally anything not nailed down. Some soldiers gambled away part of their own equipment, which commanders strongly discouraged because it was difficult to look intimidating while asking to borrow your neighbor's shield. Of course, fights sometimes broke out over gambling debts. But these were usually short-lived because the commander had very strong opinions about anything that disrupted the illusion of discipline. Telling exaggerated stories, the ancient equivalent of posting online. You might imagine ancient soldiers swapped brave tales of battle. And they did. But these stories followed a predictable pattern. Every soldier had a story that made him sound heroic. And every story became slightly more heroic with each retelling. One soldier might describe how he once wrestled a wild boar. Another might claim he bested 3 men with a single spear. Someone else would boast about a romantic conquest that definitely did not happen. After enough retellings, many soldiers began believing their own embellishments. It passed the time, boosted morale, and annoyed the listener, all desirable outcomes. Practicing drills. The official activity no one enjoyed. Soldiers didn't only spend their time lounging. Commanders insisted on drills to keep men ready, even though the men felt perfectly ready to continue lounging. Drills included shield practice, formation marching, throwing spears, sword patterns, rehearsing battle cries which sounded less intimidating when done sleepily. Most soldiers groaned through this with the enthusiasm of students being told they had a surprise homework assignment. Still, drills helped maintain some semblance of discipline, especially after long stretches of gambling, drinking, and philosophical arguments about whether onions counted as a vegetable or a punishment. Making and repairing equipment. Slow, tedious, necessary. Let's wander over to a quieter area of the camp. Here, soldiers sit cross-legged, repairing armor that never quite fits and sandals that seem determined to fall apart. A shocking amount of military life involved sewing. Yes, sewing. Tunics ripped easily. Belts frayed. Sandals wore down. Cloaks developed holes at a rate that defies explanation. Weapons needed constant maintenance too. Spears had to be resharpened. Swords needed oiling. Shields needed reinforcing with whatever scraps were available. A soldier who maintained his gear had a better chance of surviving battle. A soldier who didn't, was encouraged by the others to start maintaining his gear. So mending became soothing in its own way, something to do with your hands while complaining gently in the background. Initiating new recruits. Mild hazing, ancient style. Whenever fresh recruits arrived, usually looking eager and freshly scrubbed, older soldiers took it upon themselves to educate them. Not brutally. Just persistently. They might tell recruits impossible tasks. Go ask the quartermaster for a spear that doesn't bend. Tell the cook we're out of wind seasoning. He'll know what you mean. Check the ditch for enemy spies. Bring me the sky rope for raising the stars. New recruits dutifully attempted these quests, returning confused but wiser. This tradition strengthened the ranks. It taught humility. And it gave veteran soldiers the one thing they adored, entertainment. Writing letters, or dictating them. Many soldiers were illiterate, but that didn't stop them from sending letters. They simply found someone who could write and paid them in bread or favors. Letters served 3 purposes. 1. Reassuring families that the soldier was alive. 2. Requesting money, because pay was unreliable. 3. Making everything sound more impressive than it was. A typical letter home might say something like, "Camp life is comfortable. I am strong. The commanders admire my skill. Do send more socks." Meanwhile, the real situation was, "Everything hurts. My tent smells like 6 grown men. Please send anything resembling food." But the letter writing ritual provided comfort. It also allowed soldiers to imagine home as they wished it were, not as it was. Making music, badly. Ancient camps were noisy at night, not from battle cries, but from music. Someone always had a pipe, or a lyre missing one string, or just two sticks they insisted were instruments. Soldiers sang. They weren't good at it. But enthusiasm counted for more than skill. There were drinking songs, marching songs, songs about women they missed, or women they definitely invented. Sometimes officers tried to enforce quiet hours. Sometimes they gave up entirely. Music brought the camp together. It also helped drown out the endless chorus of snores. Bonding through questionable drinks. Wine and beer were the ancient soldiers' best friends. Or worst enemies. Usually both. Water wasn't always safe, so alcohol became the go-to beverage. Some soldiers drank heavily out of boredom. Others as part of unofficial rituals. Some drank moderately, but these were rare and generally distrusted. Drinking passed the time. It lifted spirits. It also produced stories that men would retell decades later with great pride and very little accuracy. Developing strange camp hobbies. Some soldiers cultivated small personal hobbies to keep sane. Common ones included carving wooden figures, sharpening stones, far more calming than it sounds, crafting makeshift board games, practicing wrestling techniques, collecting feathers, because why not? Attempting philosophy after one too many drinks. These hobbies were simple, repetitive, calming. They kept the mind and hands occupied. They prevented too much thinking about the next battle. Befriending animals. The unspoken tradition. Let's drift near the animal pens. Here soldiers fed goats that didn't belong to them and adopted stray dogs that followed the camp everywhere. A surprising number of ancient armies had unofficial mascots. Dogs, cats, donkeys, chickens with unsettling confidence, the occasional goat with a strong personality. Soldiers cared for these animals like treasured companions. They offered comfort, distraction, and the illusion of normal life. An army might lose half its supplies and still find a way to feed the camp dog. Priorities were priorities. Philosophizing about life badly. In long stretches of boredom, soldiers tended to become philosophers. Not good philosophers, just determined ones. They sat by the fire asking, what is courage? Why do we fight? Do onions count as vegetables? Is the commander secretly an idiot? Does life have meaning, or is it just marching forever? The answers weren't profound, but the discussions killed time. Waiting. Always waiting. And after all these activities, soldiers returned to the one thing that defined ancient warfare. Waiting. Waiting for orders. Waiting for dawn. Waiting for the next march. Waiting for the enemy. Waiting for something to change. Time passed slowly. Days blurred into weeks. Weeks into months. Camps shifted locations but kept the same patterns, the same routines, the same smells, the same endless debates over whose turn it was to fetch water. War wasn't constant fighting. It was constant waiting for fighting. And soldiers learned to fill that space with anything: gambling, singing, carving, arguing, cooking, teasing. Recruits, repairing sandals, petting stray dogs, complaining about onions. It wasn't glamorous. But it was life. We'll drift on again soon, into another soft corner of history, where ordinary people and powerful elites alike stumbled through their strange, imperfect worlds. Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's settle in again, breathe a little slower, and drift into another corner of the ancient world. Tonight, we're wandering far beyond stone walls and settled fields. Past the boundaries of ancient kingdoms, past dusty roads and sleepy villages. Out onto the open steppe, where the horizon is a wide, endless line and the wind never quite stops talking. This is the world of the ancient nomadic warrior societies, Huns, Scythians, Xiongnu, early Turks, and all the other horse-bound empires that left settled civilizations slightly terrified and deeply confused. And inside those moving camps and tents live the women, wives, daughters, mothers, widows, who didn't appear in most historical records. Not because they were unimportant, but because sedentary scribes didn't know what to make of a culture where women sometimes wrote as well as the men, handled the money, managed the herds, occasionally shot arrows, and had very strong opinions about how tents should be arranged. So let's drift into that world, softly, slowly, because the daily lives of nomadic women weren't defined by luxury or leisure. They were defined by motion, adaptation, and a kind of practical resilience that made settled societies deeply uncomfortable. The first thing to understand, they worked constantly. Life inside a nomadic society did not involve long stretches of lounging. Women's work was the engine of survival. Sedentary observers imagined nomads as wild, impulsive warriors. But the truth is, none of that was possible unless women kept everything else functioning. A nomadic camp was like a small moving city. And the women ran it. They were responsible for packing and unpacking the tent, pitching the tent, which was not a small task when the tent was made of heavy felt, herding goats and sheep, milking animals, processing milk into butter, cheese, yogurt, and fermented drinks, making clothing, repairing clothing, managing trade, raising children, educating those children in how not to fall off a horse, maintaining household goods, and acting as diplomats between families, clans, and the occasional visiting merchant who smelled faintly of camel and desperation. It was endless. If you were a woman in the steppe world, you woke up at dawn, saw a vast amount of work awaiting you, sighed a little, and started anyway. And if your husband rode off to war or to raid or to go negotiate something vague with the clan chief, well, congratulations, your workload just doubled. The tent, their domain, their craft, their fortress. Nomadic homes, yurts, gurs, portable felt tents, were feats of engineering disguised as simple round huts. Most were built and maintained by women. This meant that, in a cultural twist that confused foreign ambassadors, the woman of the household quite literally owned the home, because she made it. The husband owned the horses, the weapons, the saddles, and occasionally a very questionable haircut. The wife owned the dwelling. And this mattered. It meant she controlled household decisions, guest etiquette, placement of sacred objects, food distribution, storage of valuables, sleeping arrangements, and, perhaps most importantly, who had permission to enter. Visitors who stepped into a woman's tent without respect quickly discovered that nomadic women had very strong opinions about boundaries. And wooden ladles could be surprisingly persuasive when wielded with feeling. The tent was the heart of nomadic life. It was where families slept, ate, worked, and sometimes held ceremonies. Women arranged everything inside with meticulous care, because order mattered in a world where everything outside the tent was unpredictable. And when it was time to move, women took the entire thing apart, packed it onto carts, helped load the animals, and then rebuilt it miles away, often before the men even finished debating where exactly to stop for the day. Young girls, not quite princesses, not quite free daughters in nomadic societies grew up fast. There were no idle courtly lessons, no embroidery samplers, and no polite etiquette instructors wandering around correcting their posture. Instead, daughters learned how to ride, often before they could fully walk, how to milk animals without getting kicked, how to gather fuel, how to identify weather signs, how to sew and repair clothing, how to pack and pitch a tent, how to handle a bow, at least well enough to scare off wolves, how to negotiate with other families, and perhaps most importantly, how to avoid stepping in anything left behind by livestock. Nomadic childhoods were not gentle, but they were full of movement, freedom, and responsibility. Girls were not ornamental. They were essential. And in some societies, Scythians, Sarmatians, and others, girls genuinely trained alongside boys in horseback combat. These cultures eventually inspired Greek tales of Amazon warriors, which were exaggerated, of course, but based on something real. A Scythian girl might be expected to shoot from horseback, herd sheep across long distances, and chase away raiders with nothing but fierce determination and a notched arrow. And that was just Tuesday. Marriage. Practical, negotiated, sometimes surprisingly flexible. Marriage among nomadic people wasn't usually romantic. It was strategic. Families met. Negotiations happened. Animals were exchanged. Everyone pretended they were getting a good deal. But unlike in many sedentary societies, nomadic women often had some level of input. Sometimes a lot. A woman with skills, strong rider, good herder, smart negotiator, had value. And value meant leverage. Did women always have a choice? No. But they had more influence over the process than many of their contemporaries in walled cities. And once married, many women retained control of their tent and household goods. This meant that the new husband didn't exactly move in, he aligned himself with her household structure. It's hard to be patriarchal when your wife owns the roof. The daily rhythm, work, work, more work, and the occasional song. From dawn until dusk, work filled the day. Daughters fetched water, mended clothes, and watched younger siblings. Mothers churned milk into fermented drinks. Grandmothers oversaw weaving and hearth rituals. Aunts managed herds. But in the evenings, the camp transformed. Fires were lit. Stories were told. Songs were sung, often loudly, sometimes beautifully, occasionally both. Women's songs passed down clan histories, genealogies, advice, warnings, and jokes that probably made no sense outside the camp circle. Music traveled with them. Stories traveled. Women were the keepers of memory, especially in cultures where writing was limited. Without them, lineage would blur. Names would fade. And warriors would forget who they were supposed to be impressive for. Mobility. A blessing, a burden, and a lifestyle. Being constantly on the move shaped everything. Women had to pack their entire life into objects that could be carried by cart, camel, or horse. They had no heavy pottery, no stone foundations, no permanent furniture, no attic full of sentimental items. Life was lightweight, efficient, and intentional. If something couldn't travel, it didn't exist. And this gave nomadic women a strange kind of freedom. They were never tied to a single location. Their world was measured in horizons, not in borders. But mobility also meant unpredictability. Storms, harsh winters, enemy raids, lost herds, leaders making questionable decisions that required polite smiling and private frustration. Nomadic families developed resilience not because they wanted to, but because the steppe provided no other option. The social power behind the scenes. Nomadic women weren't equal in the modern sense, but they had influence, practical, domestic, and political. They controlled household wealth, tent ownership, the distribution of food, care of livestock, management of trade, social networks among families. In many nomadic societies, marriage alliances were political tools, and women were the diplomats, matchmakers, negotiators, and peacekeepers. A man could lead warriors. A woman could bind clans. Foreign envoys often noted that nomadic women spoke freely in public. Sometimes they even advised chiefs. This confused sedentary diplomats, who expected women to be silent, decorative, and ideally invisible. Instead, they encountered women who debated politics, organized feasts, critiqued trade deals, and occasionally threatened to hit someone with a ladle if they were being unreasonable. It was a different world. Spirit work and ritual knowledge. In many steppe cultures, women handled ritual activities. They acted as healers, fortune tellers, midwives, keepers of sacred objects, interpreters of dreams, and guides for ceremonies honoring ancestors or sky spirits. Men dealt with warfare. Women dealt with the invisible world. This division gave women an authority that outsiders couldn't fully comprehend. A warrior might lead a raid, but his wife was the one who ensured the spirits were honored properly. Superstition, survival, tradition, they all intertwined. Widowhood. Hard, complicated, surprisingly independent. When a husband died, an unfortunately common occurrence in warrior societies, a woman's status shifted quickly. In some cultures, she returned to her birth family. In others, she inherited the tent and some of the livestock. Sometimes she remarried, sometimes not. And while some societies had restrictive customs, many nomadic widows had more independence than their sedentary counterparts. A capable widow could run her own household, manage her own herds, participate in trade, act as a clan matriarch, and occasionally refuse remarriage entirely. This shocked outsiders, who expected widows to be quiet, obedient, and financially helpless. Nomadic widows, meanwhile, were often managing 40 goats and negotiating trade rates with strangers. The hard parts. Life for these women wasn't idyllic. It was full of hardship. They faced high mortality rates, long winter migrations, exhausting labor, limited medical knowledge, warfare that could spill into camps, environmental dangers, childbirth in unpredictable conditions. But within all of this, they carved out systems of cooperation, kinship, and shared labor that kept life going. Nomadic societies depended on female labor completely, though the male warriors were often presented as the glamorous face of the culture. The truth was quieter. The women built the tents. The women kept the herds alive. The women organized the home. The women taught the children. The women held the community together while the men were off chasing enemies across the horizon. Without the women, the nomadic world wouldn't have functioned for a single season. And with that, we'll drift onward soon. Into more quiet corners of history, where ordinary people lived extraordinary, and often unrecorded, lives. Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's settle in again, nice and slow, and drift into another corner of history, the kind that isn't covered in heroic portraits or elegant court memoirs. Tonight we're wandering into the quieter aftermath of scandal. Because while kings and nobles tended to make spectacular mistakes, public, expensive, occasionally ridiculous ones, their children were the people who actually had to live with the consequences. So if you're wrapped up and relaxed, perfect. Because we're going to slip into early modern Europe, from the 1500s to the 1700s, where reputation was everything. And losing that reputation meant more than a few awkward glances at court. It meant your children's lives changed overnight, often in ways that were quietly tragic, faintly absurd, and very much designed by bureaucrats who never questioned whether any of this made sense. Let's wander there now. First things first, noble status was not a personal achievement. It was inherited. Glue-like. Sticky, even when unwanted. If a noble father committed treason, insulted the king, angered the church, backed the wrong faction, dated the wrong person, or simply annoyed someone more important, his title, lands, and fortune could be stripped away in a single royal decree. The father usually ended up in exile, in prison, in a monastery, under house arrest, or, if the king was feeling very theatrical that day, executed calmly in a courtyard at dawn. But the children, they were handled more softly, more quietly, more bureaucratically, not mercifully, just quietly. The overnight disappearance of wealth. Let's drift into the first shock most of these children faced. The sudden, elegant vanishing of their entire family's wealth. One day, they were riding fine horses, wearing ridiculous lace collars, and being told they were the future of their house. The next day, everything was gone. Not gradually, gone. Nobles didn't lose property the way normal people do. There was no slow financial collapse or eviction notice. There was a decree, a confiscation, a team of royal officials who arrived to catalog every item down to the spoons, and a polite but firm reminder that, these carpets now belong to His Majesty. Children learned quickly that wealth was conditional. Conditional on their father not having offended literally anyone with the power to write a declaration. The immediate rebranding of the children. In early modern Europe, identity was public. You were not just a person, you were a surname, a lineage, a reputation wearing boots. So when a noble fell from grace, the children didn't just lose money. They lost their public identity. Titles evaporated. Coats of arms were revoked. Family crests were politely removed from any public display. Some children were given new surnames. Softer ones. Less offensive to the crown. Sometimes suspiciously generic, like Duvalin or de la Rue, words that sounded noble-ish but carried exactly zero political influence. It was like being reissued a personality by the state. Education. Not gone, but heavily downgraded. Originally, these children might have studied languages, fencing, philosophy, court etiquette, diplomacy, everything needed for a glittering future at court. After the fall, their education became practical. Not practical as in, useful, but practical as in, affordable. They learned basic literacy, basic arithmetic, how to behave modestly, how not to attract attention, how to find work without causing a political scandal. and how to avoid discussing their father in public, ever. These children were usually placed in the care of tutors who were paid half as much to teach twice as little. And the tutors always emphasized the same lesson. You are no longer important. Please act accordingly. Exile, but for children. Sometimes the disgrace was so severe that the family was exiled. But exiling children directly was considered a bit extreme, even for early modern Europe, which had extremely flexible definitions of justice. So instead, they were relocated. This meant the children were sent to distant relatives, remote monasteries, unimportant estates, or foreign courts where nobody cared who they were. These were not punishments. They were protective measures, which is what governments call punishments when they want to feel dignified. Exiled noble children often grew up in places where nobody recognized their surname, nobody cared about their lineage, nobody asked about their disgraced parent, nobody expected anything from them. For many, it was the first taste of anonymity. Some found it liberating. Most found it confusing. A few found it exactly as depressing as you'd imagine. When children were placed in monasteries, this was the state's favorite solution. Practical, cheap, and conveniently quiet. Young boys were sent to monasteries. Young girls to convents. Not because they were pious. Not because they expressed interest. But because monasteries were safe, controlled environments where embarrassing aristocrats could not go around causing diplomatic trouble. Inside the cloister, these children lived predictable, controlled lives of prayers, silence, breathing incense every day for years, learning Latin reluctantly, and eating whatever the monastery defined as food on any given day. Some eventually took vows. Some left once adults. Some stayed because they'd forgotten how to live anywhere else. But the important note here is, monastic life was the early modern equivalent of quietly shelving a political problem. Children were not punished. They were just placed somewhere far from the court. Somewhere where they couldn't develop ambitions. Living with maternal relatives. If the mother was still alive, or still socially acceptable, the children might go live with her family. This could be comforting, or extremely awkward. Maternal relatives often had opinions about the disgraced father, ranging from he made a foolish mistake to he was a political disaster disguised as a man. But they took in the children anyway, because blood ties mattered. These children grew up among cousins who often had their own ambitions, and who had been raised to believe that politics was a delicate dance requiring poise, loyalty, and clever maneuvering. Which made it somewhat unfortunate that their new roommate came from a household where everything had gone catastrophically wrong. Maternal households typically offered these children a chance at normalcy. Not luxury, normalcy. They learned quiet manners, how to navigate polite society cautiously, how not to trigger political gossip, which topics were off limits forever, and which relatives were safe to trust, usually very few. The quiet danger of royal court memory. One of the strangest problems disgraced nobles' children faced was the royal court's inability to forget anything. Courtiers remembered who rebelled, who plotted, who whispered the wrong thing, who backed the wrong faction, who annoyed the monarch, and who had thrown that one unfortunate party 30 years prior. So even if the children managed to return to society as adults, they found something chilling. People remembered. Even if the scandal happened before they were born. Even if it had nothing to do with them. Even if the original event was exaggerated, inaccurate, or just badly gossiped. The stain of their father's disgrace lingered. It didn't make them social pariahs, exactly, just fragile commodities. Glass ornaments that no one quite wanted to display. The limited opportunities phase of adulthood. As these children reached adulthood, they discovered that noble society had a subtle but very powerful tool. Gatekeeping. Some careers were inappropriate for children of disgraced houses. Court officer. Too political. Military commander. Too risky. Diplomatic work. Absolutely not. Clerical administration. Possibly, but only if they demonstrated extreme docility. Acceptable careers included minor military service in distant provinces, clerkships with limited authority, managing rural estates for distant cousins, convent administration, teaching, joining acceptable but unimportant religious orders. These opportunities were not humiliating, just limited, designed to keep them out of the king's way and out of trouble. Marriage was complicated. For daughters, especially, marriage prospects depended entirely on how much stigma clung to the family name. Possible outcomes included 1. Marrying into a lower-ranking but respectable family, who appreciated the connection but preferred not to think too hard about it. 2. Remaining unmarried, either by choice or because no one wanted the political baggage. 3. Entering a convent, which was society's elegant way of saying, "We have no idea what to do with her." 4. Marrying someone from a similarly tarnished family, which was a bit like two people consoling each other with matching emotional baggage. For sons, marriage remained possible, but rarely advantageous. They tended to marry women whose families had fewer expectations and fewer choices. Subtle, quiet alliances formed in the margins of noble society. Some children did rebuild the family name. History is full of stories of fallen noble families eventually regaining royal favor. Sometimes the king forgave the family after a generation. Sometimes a son proved loyal in war. Sometimes a daughter married well enough to open doors. Sometimes a relative petitioned the crown relentlessly until the title was restored. But these recoveries were gradual, gentle, almost sleepy in pace. Rehabilitation was not dramatic. It was a slow social thaw. People began speaking the surname again. Cousins acknowledged the connection. An invitation was extended for a minor royal ceremony. Then, eventually, something larger. But even when restoration happened, the memory of disgrace never vanished completely. Early modern nobles were excellent at holding grudges. And even better at quietly reminding others of them. The most important truth: their lives became quiet. Not tragic. Not glamorous. Just quiet. These children were taught to live modestly, carefully, respectfully, out of the spotlight. They did not rebel. They did not seek revenge. They did not challenge the crown. They lived small, deliberate lives designed to avoid repeating their parents' mistakes. And maybe that was the point. Early modern Europe loved spectacle. But it also loved order. And the children of disgraced nobles had only one responsibility: maintain order. Never give the court another reason to look their way. And with that, we'll drift on again soon. Into another soft, strange, sleepy corner of history. Where the powerful stumbled. And everyone else quietly dealt with the consequences.